We, as a church, for the last few months, we've been looking at the book of Exodus in the Bible. We've been looking at kind of God's plans for his people and how he's kind of redeemed them and brought them out of all sorts of trouble. And so Nick is going to come and carry on looking at that series now. So can we just have a little warm round of applause for Mr. Nick?
Thank you. Very good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing you to Gideon in a moment, and Gideon is going to just read the passage that we're looking at this morning. Before he does that, I'd just like to say one thing. As we were worshipping today, before, a few minutes ago, I just got a thing from God, which was, this is not a history lesson. Okay? This is not a history lesson. I am not, thank goodness, a history teacher. So as Gideon reads this passage, don't just see this as, oh yeah, this is a thing that happened years ago, what a lovely story. As he reads, just think, what would I be thinking and feeling if this happened to me? All right, Gideon, over to you. Good.
Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went to the desert shore. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink his water because it was bitter. Here's Moses saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Then the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them, and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, it will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to the Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water.
Excellent, thanks Gideon. So let's just kind of put you in the picture. Last week, Carl was speaking and he spoke about the Israelites coming to the Red Sea, being followed by the Egyptians. And God told Moses to put his staff down, and the Red Sea parted. The Israelites went through the Red Sea. The Egyptians followed them. The Israelites got out the other side, and then they turned and looked, and the sea was closing back over the Egyptian army. And it says, the horses and the riders, all of them were killed. So you imagine this kind of picture. These people who have been in slavery, the Israelite people have been in slavery in Egypt for years, and now before their eyes, having just seen this amazing miracle, they are seeing their oppressors drown. They are seeing the people that have been oppressing them, keeping them in slavery, drown. And they were now free, right? And we heard from Carl last week that they sang, they worshipped. I imagine, put yourself in the picture, I imagine they might have danced a little bit. I imagine they probably had a bit of a party because they were now free. But as we've just heard from Gideon, we then move into verse 22, and we read that Moses then led them into the desert of Shur, where they were without water for 3 days. Now, I've got to confess something. As I was planning this, the first few times that I read this through, I kind of went, okay, then they were without water for 3 days. And then they started moaning. What moaners? And I just thought, like, 3 days without water. I don't know why. For some reason, to me, it didn't actually seem like a lot. So, like all good preachers do, I decided to do some Googling. So I Googled, how long can you live without water? And bizarrely, 3 days is basically how long humans can survive without water before we start really, really struggling. So I feel that I need to kind of confess that, having called out the Israelites as a bunch of moaners for no reason, actually they were in the desert. I think they're pretty hot deserts, right? They're in the desert and they haven't had water for 3 days. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but when I start Googling, sometimes I disappear down a bit of a Google rabbit hole. And so I kept Googling, and actually what I found was that back in 1979, an 18-year-old Austrian bricklayer called Andreas actually lasted 18 days without water. And what happened is police had put him into a holding cell, and then they forgot about him. And the story goes that Andreas could survive that long because he licked the condensation off the walls of the cell that he was in. So yeah, I said it was a rabbit hole. I just thought I'd take you down there. So 3 days, let's go back to that, quick. Let's get back to the Israelites. So, they've been walking for 3 days, and then they find this water at Mara, but they couldn't drink the water because the water was bitter. And that was the final straw. Okay, so let's imagine it. You've been thirsty for 3 days in the desert. You've probably been praying to God, like, flipping at God, what are you doing? You brought us out of Egypt, you did that amazing miracle, but now we're thirsty. We could do with some water, right? You're beginning to feel weak and weird, and then you come to some water and you probably were like, amazing, God's answered my prayer. But then you taste the water, and the water is bitter. It's not fit for drinking. Imagine how they were feeling. They've gone from chapter 15, verse 21, where it says, they were singing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Right? That amazing feeling. And now, just 3 more verses from there, in verse 24, it says, so the people grumbled against Moses. So first things first, this is a stark reminder to all of us that it only takes 3 verses to go from to grumble. How often in your life has it taken you just 3 verses to have forgotten something amazing that God has done for you before you slip into that world of moaning? Life has an amazing way of moving from major highs to major lows. And that certainly doesn't change for us as Christians. Now, some of you will remember 9 years ago, almost to the day, my wife Jude and me and our little lad at the time, Charlie, and Stella, who was only young, and Jude was pregnant with Johnny. We moved into a flat, and the first night that we moved into that flat, we had a big fire in the middle of the night. And it was so big that we even managed to get onto the BBC. And somehow we got out of that flat alive. And our elation was just amazing. It was dramatic. I remember the feeling about 3 in the morning. I was stood in my pajama bottoms. It was drizzling. And this hunky big fireman came up to me. And I suddenly was aware of my lack of hunkiness. And he came over and he said, we've put the fire out, and we're prepared to go back into the smouldering building to get you some essentials. And I was like, no, we are just so delighted to have got out there alive. Honestly, just when we got alive, we don't need anything more. And he went, yeah, no, that's absolutely fine, and I get it. But a lot of people say things like, could you get our keys and our mobile phones and our bank cards and maybe some of the kids' toys? And I was like, yeah, all of those actually, yeah, we could do with all of those. And then, as all good Christians do, when things have gone wrong, you ring Tom. And so we went round to Tom and Rachel's house and we slept in their living room. And then at about 6 in the morning, so we got to bed probably about 4 in the morning, about 6 in the morning, my phone rang. And it was someone ringing to tell me that my granddad had been rushed into hospital. Real highs, real lows. I've no doubt at all that God saved us from that burning building that night. The next afternoon, I was stood in the room with a fire investigator who was looking to see why the fire had happened. And he looked around and he just said, "You are so lucky to have got out of this. A minute more and it would have been a different story." So that one had an amazing ending. We got out alive, elation. The Grandad story didn't end quite so well. I got a call that same afternoon and it was to say, "Look, you need to get here. Come and get here quick. It's not going to last for much longer." So I jumped in the car, I rushed up the M11, looking a bit like a chimney sweep out of Mary Poppins. And I raced onto his ward. There was no one around. And I thought, right, what do they do in Casualty? Oh, in Casualty, they like have a board up, don't they? So I was like running around, found this board, and found my granddad's name, and saw the cubicle that he was in. And so I rushed into this cubicle. And there was my granddad, peacefully sleeping. And I thought, yes, I've got here. And I went over and put my hand on my granddad, and I whispered, "Hello, Granddad, it's Nicholas. I'm here." And he didn't move. And I said aloud, "Oh, you're not there anymore, are you, Grandad?" And at that moment, some rather sheepish nurses came running into the room and they said, "We're so sorry, you shouldn't be in here. Your Grandad just passed away, just moments before you got here." And for me, that was a really big deal, that I missed saying goodbye to my Grandad. Probably more of a big deal than it should be. And writing this, I was like, why is that important to me? But it really, really was. My Grandad was a Christian, an amazing man, so I know I'm going to see him one day. But in that moment, I'd moved from the elation of escaping a fire to being there with my Grandad and just thinking, why did I not just get the opportunity to say goodbye to him in those few moments? So real life highs, real life lows. So let's look back at the Israelites. I find it really fascinating that if you look at the miracle that God had just done for them, right? It was water-based. Right? He had taken the sea and moved the sea apart, and they were thirsty and needed a drink, right? So they just experienced God going, "Oh, we can move a sea, we can part a sea." And yet, when thirsty and in needing of a drink, they didn't kind of think, "Oh, he did that pretty cool thing with water a while ago. I mean, maybe we could just ask for him to do something else cool with water. Maybe we could ask him to purify this water that we've now got in front of us." But they don't do that. Instead, they grumble. Their memories are so short. And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with grumbling. I think that, if we grumble at God, we go, "God, I'm really not, this feels wrong, this feels, why is life treating me like this? Why am I going through this?" I think that's fine. But they don't grumble at God. They don't even grumble to Moses. They grumble behind his back. They start moaning. The guy who just helped them escape from slavery, they've chosen now to grumble. Now, we would obviously never grumble about our elders, would we? We would never ever have moments where we question what our elders are doing and kind of, think that they might have it wrong. I'm sure that would never ever happen. So moving on, I've got a question for you. So Kev said he would never grumble.
No, I think I've never grumbled at Steve.
Okay, there you go. Fair enough. The Lord has given him wisdom. This is good. It's very good. So here's a question. Where do you turn when things go wrong? When things go wrong in your life, where do you turn? Let's look at the difference with how Moses responds to how the Israelites respond. It says in verse 25, "Then Moses cried out to the Lord." There's a clear difference here. Moses was probably as thirsty as the other Israelites, probably as grumpy. Do you know what? I reckon he was more disillusioned than they were, because he had been the one hearing from God. And yet, he goes straight to God. He cries out directly to God. It says, "Then the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test." Now, a really interesting thing here that I found, the word test here is Hebrew, the word used is Hebrew, nasa. And it's the same word that's used in Genesis 22, verse 1, where God tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And now we've got Abraham's descendants here being put to the test. Now, whether we like it or not, there are clearly moments in the Bible where God puts people to the test. Jesus himself, after being baptized, was led into the wilderness by the Spirit. And as we've just mentioned, God tested Abraham. He'd been waiting and waiting for a son. And then God said, I want you to sacrifice Isaac on this altar. So it happens, right? We go through these moments of testing. And here the Israelites are being tested. But the testing is followed up with a promise. It says in verse 26, if you listen carefully to the Lord, your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, for I am the Lord who heals you. So there's a couple of things that I want to pull out here. Let's look at the language that's being used, because it helps us understand what we should be focusing on. When the Israelites were grumpy and thirsty, they say, what are we to drink? It's all about them. Now I get it, as I said, they've been in the desert for 3 days, they're thirsty, they've come to water, they can't blink and drink it, so they moan behind Moses' back. I get it. But when Moses cries out to God, on the other hand, he hears from God. And what does he hear? He hears stuff that is all about God. Do what is right in his eyes. Pay attention to his commands. Keep all of his decrees. This is simple, guys. It's about him. It's not about us. So we get so caught up in life, we begin to think that we deserve stuff. Let's remember that this lot have just been saved, dramatically saved by God, but already they're focusing on their own needs. They've not got their eyes on God, they've got their eyes on themselves. But the moment that Moses calls out to God, he provides, he gives them this bit of wood to throw into the water, and then all is good. The bitterness of the water goes away, the water becomes drinkable. It's life-saving. Now we'll come back to the wood in a little minute. First, there's another bit that I want to focus on, and it's at the end of verse 26. God doesn't say at the end of verse 26, I am the Lord who keeps you from illness. He doesn't say, I am the Lord who keeps you safe. He says, I am the Lord who heals you, clearly suggesting that they needed healing, that they were sick. They thought that they were just super thirsty, but God says they need healing. So what did they need healing from? Well, they needed healing from the wounds of slavery. They needed healing from the past, from all that they had learned when they were slaves, from what they learned, how they acted, what they did when they were in slavery. Dare I say it, I think they may even have needed saving from themselves. You can take the Israelites out of Egypt, but then you need to take Egypt out of the Israelites. Now the Hebrew for the Lord who heals you is Yahweh Rophi. Rophi means heals, restores, or makes whole. So God is saying, I am the Lord who makes you whole. What a message. I absolutely love this. You think you're thirsty, but I am the Lord who makes you whole. And this reminds me of another really famous story in the Bible of the woman at the well. Jesus meets this woman in the heat of the day at a well. Now typically, people go to the well in the morning. Women would go together to gather the water because it was so blinking hot in the middle of the day. So the fact that this woman was there in the middle of the day getting water shows that this woman is an outcast. She's not socialising with the other people. She's there when she expects no one else to be around. And Jesus meets her there. It says in John 4:13, Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." Now this story, interestingly, is the first time that Jesus announces to anyone that he's the Messiah. He then goes on to deal with the stuff that's in this woman's life that needs healing, her multiple relationships, her attempts at making herself feel loved. Jesus is making her whole. And I thought it was amazing that Sarah shared that story this morning of her feeling that there is a woman here that just feels that the world has kind of put names on her and call her stuff. And as I was sat there thinking, it's like the woman at the well. Okay, so I was encouraged by that God is moving and speaking. So let's look at what's going on in Exodus here. The Israelites are bitter, the water is bitter, and God provides wood to make the bitter sweet again. We're pointing to Jesus in this story. The piece of wood is symbolic of the cross. We're bitter. We need saving. When we cry out to God, He provides us with a way out. Jesus, whose death on the cross makes us whole again. This makes me also want to look at the broader message that's here for us as Christians when we're discipling others. Let's look at the start of this journey that God takes the Israelites on. First, He saves them. They're saved from the Egyptians. Then He teaches them. He trains them. He shapes them and makes them whole. God doesn't take them into the desert first to train them and kind of teach them stuff there. First, He saves them. He gets them out of the Red Sea. God saves people where they're at. It's that urgent. People need to be saved from the slavery of sin and death. With the woman at the well, Jesus shows her that she needs saving before He then starts to help her change her life and think differently. Our role with other people is just like Moses. We need to help them take their eyes off themselves and put their eyes onto God. Because when you're a slave, life is all about survival. But when you're saved, it needs to be about following Jesus. It's Jesus who's going to turn the bitter to sweet. Put it another way, you may have heard this phrase before. We need to be born again. The birth bit is the saving bit, the bringing of new life. Then, once we've been born again, we need to learn how to live again. What do we do when we need something? How do we deal with disappointment? What's our attitude to money, to worship, to work, to relationships? Let's take that a little bit further. What's our response when the bloke who's fixed our tyres on a car says that he'll give us 30 quid off if we pay cash? Or if we've had a rubbish day at work and we get home, do we reach first for our Bible or do we reach for a beer or a glass of wine? As a baby learns to eat, to walk, talk, to stop being selfish, to stop grumbling, we need to do exactly the same with all that we learned when we were slaves. We need to relook at everything, putting Jesus at the centre, not us. And in this process, if you think about a baby, as they grow up, as they become toddlers, they make a mess. They make loads of mistakes. They spill food down themselves. They fall over. They mess their pants. They're learning. They're changing. And that's what we need to do as Christians. And that's what we have to do with other people to help them on their walk with Jesus. Now, a good few years back, Lisa Warren had a picture for me when my life needed a lot of sorting out. And she had a picture of a garden that had been overgrown and was being dug up and tended and weeded. But the issue that she could see was that there were all of these roots underneath that couldn't be seen from the surface, that all needed to be dug up. These were roots of stuff that I had put down in my life when I was a slave, when I wasn't saved. And they had to be dug up. This is why you need the Lord who heals you. We can't do it ourselves. It's Jesus who's the gardener. Maybe it wasn't a coincidence that when Mary saw Jesus, when he first came back from the dead, she thought he was the gardener. Maybe that points to something that Jesus loves doing that in our lives. He'd done it for Mary. He'd weeded out all the rubbish in her life. He had dug out the roots. He had turned the bitter to sweet. Now, as we get to the final verse, we read in verse 27, they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. Now, this bit I find fascinating. Elim was only 7 miles away. That's 20 kilometres. Normal people like me can walk that in about 3 hours. Steve Costa can run it in about 12 minutes. There were 12 springs, one for each of the tribes of Israel. God's full provision was there, not that far away, pretty much just round the corner. God's planning and his timing is perfect. He could have walked them straight to Elim. He's God. He knew there was fresh water there, but he chose not to. He chose to take them via Mara so that they could learn, so that they could be changed and shaped by Yahweh Rapha, the I am the Lord who makes you whole. So what is God saying to you this morning through this passage? Have you forgotten some of the amazing stuff that God's done in your life and started to moan and grumble a bit about the day-to-day? Have you been feeling a bit like you've been going through a desert, that you haven't got water, that you're being tested, that you're feeling lost, that you're unsure of the direction to take? Have you been spending too long looking at yourself and you need to fix your eyes back on Jesus? Do you need healing to be made whole again by the one who knows you and loves you? Whatever it is that you need, don't leave here this morning without speaking to someone and praying and bringing it before Jesus. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. There's stuff I'm sure that's come up through what Nick has brought, but it might be also even just experiencing us worshipping together and you feel like you want to respond to God. There's a team of guys at the back who would love to pray for you. Just recognise that this will be a moment for some people. We want to honour that and serve you in that way. But for the rest of us, there is a feast about to take place outside. So everybody is invited. Thank you so much to all those that have contributed. We do love eating together and enjoying one another's cultures. With our bellies, primarily, we really enjoy doing that. So outside, if you want to find out, if there's one thing as an Englishman I'm very proud of, right, is we're good at queuing, right? And so you'll be directed out there, and so everyone will get plenty of food. But listen, thank you so much for coming today. We've really, it's just been fun sort of being together, and do stick around for food. Next week, we will be baptising people, and it's going to be a fun affair. I know some of the stories. We may have to kind of adjust some of the camera stuff for security reasons and all that, but there's, I just want to encourage you to come along and experience that. But thanks for coming, and we will see you out there for food and the prayer meeting tonight at 7 o'clock. All right, see you later.